Hello everyone, my name is Jen and welcome to my channel. This channel is the place where I talk about my experiences as a neurodivergent person. If you want to know more about who I am and what I do, check out my introduction video. You can find this in the description box down below. Today we're going to talk about an important topic, and that is about social deficits in high-masking autistic people, or autistic people that seem to function well in the eyes of society. Social deficits are part of the autistic experience in a dominant neurotypical society. We constantly feel different from others, and even if you don't think these deficits exist, they are there. They might be invisible, but they are there, believe me. Something that is not invisible, however, is the subscription button. So, do you find this video interesting and would you like to see more on this channel? Be sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell immediately so you don't miss any of my videos again. So, people often assume that if we are articulate, we also can keep up with the environment. They see us having a conversation and we might even make eye contact with the person that we're talking to. And if we do that, we obviously don't experience social deficits, right? False, because what you see is not always what is going on at the inside. Autistic people can have social deficits, also low support needs autistics, or people who are highly masking. In this video, I will explain what these deficits may be and what this can look like. I will also talk about my own experience with it. So make yourself comfortable and let's get into the video. If autistic people could get money for every time that they heard that they don't look autistic because they behave in a socially acceptable manner, they would be rich by now. Believe me. What also comes to mind are people that react very surprised as soon as someone reveals that they are autistic. They say something like, "Oh, I couldn't tell." People usually have a certain image of autism in their mind. Like, for example, a child who is constantly lining up their toys instead of playing with other children, or an adult who prefers to isolate themselves for days on end rather than interact with others. I mean, sometimes I'm like that, but that's not the point. Or just someone who doesn't look at you understandingly when you say something, or who you can hardly have a conversation with. Of course, these things can also be part of autism, but the nuance, is important here. Some autistic people do this and some don't. These examples really show that there is an assumption that autistic traits must always be visible to the outside world in order to make you valid as an autistic person. And that you also need to show your social deficits to everyone in order to be qualified as actually autistic. With a high masking autistic person, many of those deficits will happen inside a person, internally instead of externally. And you may now be wondering, what are those social deficits if they are not necessarily visible to other people? I'm going to explain that in a moment, but first I would like to point out that certain deficits also occur because we have the feeling that we have to adapt to how society functions. Something is only a deficit if it does not fit within the set standard. For example, you will notice interesting things if an autistic person mainly surrounds themselves with people that have the same or similar neurotype. But more about that later. I will divide the most common deficits into bullet points to make a clear overview for you. Number 1. Timing is everything. It may seem like conversations between you and an autistic person flow smoothly, but that's because the autistic person is trying to time or count when they can say something. I notice that I do this quite often in conversations actually, especially when I am around neurotypical people. I find it difficult to sense when I can say something. If I don't time in my head I can just talk over someone or stay silent for too long, and that's probably because I sometimes have trouble with reading nonverbal cues. Some people sense when they can join the conversation and it totally goes by their intuition, but I don't always sense that. When my head is full and I experience sensory overload, I can find that even more difficult than it already is. And in practice, it may look like this. I literally count to 5 in my head when I think someone is ready, just to make sure I can join in on the conversation. Will you notice this? No. Does it detract from the quality of the conversation? Also no. But does it cost me a lot of energy? Yes. With neurodivergent people or people who I know have no problem with the fact that I find this difficult, I try to let go of this a little more. If I talk over them or remain silent for longer periods of time, they know that this can happen, and there is no judgment involved. This means I can save more energy and there's more brain power left to enjoy the experience. Number 2, dealing with the context. The context means certain factors within a situation. Seeing people in different contexts can be difficult. For example, you are used to a person behaving a certain way, and now that they are in a group, they suddenly behave different. As an autistic person, you can really question yourself about how to deal with this or how it happened. I personally find change very difficult and find it challenging to adapt to the new situation. Challenging, but not impossible though. It's like observing that suddenly the social rules have changed, but you don't know what they are and no one tells you what they are, so you have to assume and gamble. But you often guess wrong, and as a result, yeah, you're no longer in the conversation or you can no longer follow it. And this leads me to the third point, which is copying and imitating others. So, if you cannot lean on your own social judgment, you will try to rely on your strengths, right? For autistic people, this may involve analyzing a situation, observing, and discovering patterns in people and situations. Some autistic people can do this in great detail. This means that you can observe which behavior is accepted in the group and what people react positively to. However, the why in behavior is often more difficult. I can sometimes find it difficult to estimate how formal a situation is. You see something and see that it works, but you don't know the why or the reason behind it. And that's why you can start to imitate others in the hope that they will also accept you socially, so that you can actually join in on the conversation. For example, you try to smile more often and look approachable according to neurotypical standards. You nod at things that people say and try to throw in some facial expressions. Sometimes you can literally repeat certain phrases in the same way that someone else does. And all these things may be effective during conversations, but it's almost always at the expense of your own energy. It is quite tiring to constantly have to notice and observe how others behave or react, and to adjust your own posture accordingly. 4. Different ways of social initiation. Some of us prefer to initiate contact via text message or email. I know I like to do that myself because it's less overwhelming. I can then calmly think about what I'm going to say and how I'm going to structure my sentences. At the same time, I can ignore texts and messages for days because it's too overwhelming. My brain is like an internet browser with 37 tabs open. Why 37? I don't know, but none of them are loading. Too many ideas, not enough processing power, and then poof, shutdown mode activated. Then, after a few days or weeks, I forget that there were still unanswered messages and I have to apologize for not responding. At least the friends I have now know how this works for me and no longer think that it's a problem at all. I am also a person that likes to initiate contact. Usually, if someone has knowledge about a subject I want to know more about, we can discuss it. I like it when people bring new insights or stories. New perspectives also often bring new ideas that I would not have gotten if I had been in my own bubble, for example. Yet it has a neurodiverse edge in the sense that we are both intensely invested in the subject and we can talk about it for hours if the occasion arises. 5. Being hyperverbal. As mentioned in some of my previous videos, autism is a spectrum. This means that where you sit on that spectrum can vary greatly. Some people are regularly non-speaking or non-verbal, and others are hyperverbal. That means you talk more than what people would consider normal, or as I would say, according to neurotypical standards. Especially when it comes to our special interests, we can really involve ourselves in the conversation and talk about them a lot because you talk that much, people may wrongly judge you as an extrovert or think that you talk easily, or they think, wow, they are very self-conscious and articulate. But just because you talk a lot does not mean that you also feel how a reciprocal conversation works. You can also have a vast vocabulary and use a lot of fancy words. This sometimes make people think that you express yourself easily and that you have no trouble with being social. 6. You script conversations beforehand. You like to know what you can say and don't know what to do in certain social situations. So you practice and script conversations in advance. This can range from writing down a few points that you're going to talk about to literally scripting entire sentences and remembering them to make sure you come across a certain way. For example, you can keep these sentences in a file, practice them in the mirror or with someone you trust very much and knows that you find these types of conversations difficult. Except for the one person you entrust with this, no one sees that it is a deficit. The result is that everyone thinks you say easy flowing sentences that seem to come out naturally. If they only knew that you had been practicing for hours beforehand and you are, in fact, anxious. Number 7, trouble with making eye contact. Have you always been taught to look people in the eye because it's polite? Chances are you take this rule very literal and try to do this constantly. You try to time how long to look at someone or stare at someone constantly, and although this may seem a bit strange to the other person, well, at least there is eye contact. Especially if you have taught yourself how others do this, others will not see that you actually find eye contact super uncomfortable or difficult. From my own experience, I can tell you that in my culture, but also in Dutch culture, it is very important that you look someone in the eye when you talk to that person. It is a signal of utmost respect. This is why I used to teach myself to keep doing this, because you won't quickly notice that I find it difficult to look at you. It's just like I cannot think if I have to make eye contact at the same time and talk to you like that. It just doesn't feel natural, so to speak. Number 8, taking things literal. Just imagine that someone says, well, that just went great. Then I start to wonder if it really went great or if someone is just being sarcastic. Sometimes I can hear it, but 9 out of 10 times I find it very difficult. I really have to ask myself if something that someone said could have been sarcastic or not, especially when what someone says seems like a fairly realistic scenario. I find it difficult to judge whether someone is serious or not. Masking me would solve this by laughing it off or saying, yes, I knew what you meant. And of course, there are plenty of logical reasons why you show less of yourself and mask more. In some way, everyone does that in the interaction, right? But autistic people usually do this excessively to their own detriment. Number 9, social anxiety. Most of the time you probably don't dare to be yourself because you're constantly anxious in interaction. I hear you asking, is that so strange? No, absolutely not strange. There is nothing wrong with you. You constantly experience that you have to behave differently in a way that is not you. And this may be because you have had the experience that your authentic self was not allowed to be there. In reaction to that, you learned that covering up your behavior was a more effective coping mechanism. And that on its own is a very sad realization. I know that I was bullied a lot as a child and that I quickly realized that I should not show myself as I was. From the outside, everything seemed to be going well, but inside was a different story. Everything was piling up so fast, and whenever I had a meltdown or a shutdown, my first reaction was to run away and lock myself in my room. That way, I could be in a place where others couldn't see me and where I was protected from judgment. Or so I thought. Because, of course, I received other opinions such as, gosh, she spends so much time in her room, that's not fun. Or, why is she always walking away? Or why does she seem so cold? If you constantly receive judgments from others around you, you will almost naturally become afraid of interaction. It is also not uncommon for autistic people to be diagnosed with social anxiety disorder as well, or for autism to fly under the radar completely because it seems like social anxiety is explaining everything in a person. Sometimes that seems to be the main cause, but it is not. And that is why it's so important to have a good professional who can see all these layers of you. And if an incorrect conclusion is drawn too quickly, this will lead to incorrect treatment, and that can be really harmful. So by now you may be thinking, but Jen, you come across really well on camera. How bad can it be? Yes, that's because a camera is very different from an actual human being. And I also prepared this video in great detail. So yes, of course, it is easier then. So maybe at this point you've just lost hope and are thinking, do you even have a place where you don't experience these deficits as much? Good question. And the answer is yes, partly. Moments when it is different and easier is when I interact with other autistic people. This is very noticeable at work with my clients and when I went to Autistic, for example. I would totally recommend checking that video out, by the way, because you really get a good impression of how it went over there. When I am with neurodivergent people, I feel like I don't have to try so hard and I can just be whoever I want to be. I mean, am I accidentally talking over others? Can happen. Sometimes happens the other way around. Am I completely absorbed in an interest? Cool. Maybe another person has that same interest. Am I not looking at them? No problem. We hear with our ears, not with our eyes. Unless you are deaf, of course. By the way, in addition, a promising systematic review has been done on autistic adults' experiences of interacting with other autistic people. I quote, research has suggested that autistic people enjoy spending time with other autistic people and find them easier to talk to. And mutual understanding between autistic people created the sense of closeness. Acceptance and shared understanding with other autistic people were associated with an increased sense of belonging. Well, it's an interesting review, so I can definitely recommend reading it if you want to know more about it in depth. And of course, not all autistic people get along. We're just people with our own preferences. Who would have known? We can still get mad at each other and have arguments. Things can sometimes not match, for example, because your specific needs differ. So when I say this, I really don't speak for every autistic person. There is a possible explanation why it is so difficult to understand each other if you differ in neurotype. It's called the double empathy problem. Actually, It's a theory of Damien Milton. So Damien is a British sociologist and social psychologist who specializes in autism research. Simply put, the theory of the double empathy problem suggests that when people with very different experiences of the world interact with one another, they will of course struggle to empathize with each other and understand why someone acts the way they do. This is likely to be exacerbated through differences in language use and comprehension. So, all in all, it's quite logical why we feel different from the rest and why communication is more difficult. But it is not always noticeable, which sometimes makes it even harder. Now that you know what social deficits can consist of, I will tell you how I deal with my deficits. This very much depends on the environment I'm in. In some environments, I experience that I can regulate myself during the conversation, and this is usually the case with other neurodiverse people. But in other environments, I will have to ask for more clarification and ask to briefly summarize things and get to the point. I have actually often found it challenging to do this because there is not always understanding for the way I process information and how I socialize. And at the same time, I am increasingly allowing myself to try this out. I see more and more that there is nothing wrong with me, so why would I not try and do this if it makes it easier for me? If I need that, then it's also useful if I can ask for this and know what my needs are. And sometimes it also helps to mention what I find difficult without attaching a label to it. I notice that people are quicker to understand if they understand exactly what you're up against, rather than hearing a label and having to guess what you find difficult. So it can be very useful to practice asking what you need. Most people are very willing to support you in that. And if the environment is constantly negative or dismissive about this, it may not be the environment for you. Maybe one day I will make a video about some useful things to ask for in terms of needs and accommodations, just for inspiration. We have come to the end of the video. I want to thank you so much for watching. I hope this video gave you some insight into the invisible social deficits that can exist, even if they seem invisible. Feel free to leave any thoughts or questions in the comments below because I really love to hear from you. Please let me know if there's anything you would like to learn more about or see in future videos. I will see you in the next video. Bye!